Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Human Rights Institute's 2021 Samuel Dash Conference on Human Rights. While we wish we could gather together in person today, we're pleased that technology has made it possible to welcome participants from outside the DC area. So to those of you in the US, good morning. And to those of you across the pond and around the world, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Andy Schoenholtz, and I'm the faculty director of the Georgetown Law Human Rights Institute. I also co-direct the Center for Applied Legal Studies, the Asylum Clinic on our campus. We're pleased that you've joined us for this vital conversation on justice and accountability for atrocity crimes, facing tough challenges and forging innovative responses. As we have just marked the 10-year anniversary of the conflict in Syria and watch with increasing concern the violent and lethal crackdown against civilians peacefully protesting the military coup in Myanmar, we see the urgency of coming together as a legal community and human rights lawyers to discuss ways in which we can address these pressing matters. We will be joined today by several members of the Georgetown community, including Professors James Stromseth and David Luban, as well as Dean William Traynor. We will also be featuring the work of the students in HRI's fact-finding practicum. As always, the engagement of the Georgetown community in this conference each year is a testament to Sam Dash's lasting impact on all of us. As many of you know, the Dash Conference is an annual event organized by the Human Rights Institute and held in honor of Professor Sam Dash, who was a cherished member of our faculty for nearly 4 decades. Professor Dash's family, friends, students, and colleagues created this conference in his memory after he passed away in 2004. And each year we have gathered to remember his important legacy and focus on the human rights issues that were so important to him. In addition to teaching at Georgetown between 1965 and 2004, he served on the board of the International League for Human Rights and traveled widely to pursue justice. Perhaps best known for his role as chief counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee, Professor Dash pressed for justice and accountability at home and abroad, and led human rights missions to Northern Ireland, the Soviet Union, and Chile. In 1985, he became the first American to visit Nelson Mandela in prison and participated in the negotiations that ultimately led to Mandela's release. We are thankful to be joined virtually today by members of the Dash family, particularly Sam's daughters, Judy and Rachel. Along with the rest of the Dash family, they have continued to be valued members of the Georgetown community and participated each year in the Dash Conference. There are countless scholars, lawyers, and human rights defenders who followed in Professor Dash's footsteps, and we continue to be grateful for the family's contribution to the Law Center and the broader legal community. As I mentioned, this year's Dash Conference is focused on justice and accountability for atrocity crimes, facing tough challenges and forging innovative responses, a topic that is as timely today as ever. The foundation of the modern conception of justice and accountability for atrocity crimes under international law was forged over 75 years ago. It was at Nuremberg that individuals were first held responsible for crimes against humanity. A few years later, in 1948, the Genocide Convention was signed just a day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly. But it would be another 50 years before the Rome Statute was adopted, including the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity within the jurisdiction of the newly created International Criminal Court. While crimes against humanity were first included in the 1945 Charter of the International Military Tribunal, it was only in 2019 that the International Law Commission adopted draft articles on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity and recommended the elaboration of a convention more than 70 years after the Genocide Convention. As this demonstrates, progress in the law often takes time, and our work is ever evolving. Our keynote speaker today, Professor Philippe Sands, will share with us some of the story of the origination of these concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, as explored in his book, East-West Street, how the search for justice continued following the atrocities of the Second World War, and what the state of the law means as we confront our present-day challenges. Before we get to Professor Sands' talk, we will start our day examining some of the most pressing crises we are facing in the global quest for justice and accountability for atrocities crimes, the situations in Myanmar, Syria, and China. We are honored to have with us today Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. We invited him to speak on the allegations of genocide against the Rohingya, but have watched in horror as the situation in Myanmar has rapidly deteriorated following the February 1 military coup. So we are also eager to hear from him on the current situation and actions that can be taken by the international community. We are also honored to hear from Beth and Schaack, the Leah Kaplan visiting professor in human rights at Stanford Law School, expert on the prevention and accountability for mass atrocities, and author of the recently published book, Envisioning Justice for Syria. Finally, it's a privilege to welcome Param-Preet Singh, the Associate Director of the International Justice Program at Human Rights Watch, who will be speaking on our first panel about potential pathways to accountability for crimes committed against the Uyghurs in China. This conversation will be moderated by Professor James Stromseth, an expert in justice and accountability for atrocity crimes and one of our wonderful human rights profs here at Georgetown. Following the keynote address, the afternoon's panel will be a roundtable discussion focusing on the future of international criminal justice at the International Criminal Court. The United States has long had a fraught relationship with the ICC, at times cooperating in the prosecution of notorious criminals, while other times resisting and undermining the work of the ICC, as was the case with the imposition of sanctions on the Office of the Prosecutor during the Trump administration. We are privileged to have with us today Professor Meg de Guzman, an expert on international criminal law and one of the plaintiffs in the case challenging the sanctions imposed on the ICC by the United States. I am sure she, as well as the other panelists joining us today, were pleased to hear the news on Friday that the Biden administration has lifted the sanctions against the ICC. We are also honored to welcome Todd Buchwald, the former ambassador and special coordinator for the State Department's Office of Global Criminal Justice, and Charles Jallow, a professor of law at Florida International University and member of the United Nations International Law Commission, both enormously respected for their expertise on the court and international criminal law. Professor David Luban, another one of our exceptional human rights professors at Georgetown, whose expertise includes international criminal law, will be leading the discussion with this impressive panel. We will start and end the day focusing on one of the most challenging situations of our time, Syria. In the final session of the day, students from HRI's fact-finding practicum will present their research analyzing attacks on healthcare as a driver of forced displacement in Syria. Our students this year overcame enormous challenges to conduct their investigations entirely online. We hope that you will join us for their important presentation. Before we begin our program today, there are a few people I wish to thank. First, I want to thank our keynote speaker, our panelists, and our moderators who are taking time out of their extraordinarily busy schedules to join us here today. Every year, we are honored to welcome world-renowned experts who make this conference so rich and enlightening. I also want to take a moment to especially thank Melissa Stewart, the Dash Muse Teaching Fellow and Adjunct Professor of Law here at Georgetown Law's Human Rights Institute. Through her collaborative efforts with Professors Stromseth and Luban, Melissa is responsible for conceptualizing the vision for this year's conference. and executing on countless details in order to convene this distinguished group of experts and create a space for you, our audience, to join us. We are also grateful to so many staff here at Georgetown Law, whose efforts ensure that the day runs as smoothly as possible, particularly our events, AV, and communications teams, including Kara Dubbs, Kyle Bernardos, and Tanya Weinberg. Finally, I want to thank you, our conference participants, for joining us. We hope that you find the sessions enriching and that they contribute to your understanding of human rights. A bit of housekeeping. The DASH conference is being recorded and will be made available on our website and circulated to all conference participants. We plan to have time during each session for Q&A. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. Also, you should have received the program and bios of our speakers in advance. Links to both documents are being pasted in the chat now so that you have them for your reference. With that, I will pass it off to Professor Jane Stromseth, who is moderating our first panel. Professor Stromseth.
Thank you very much, Andy, and greetings, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists and each of you in our global audience to our opening panel on accountability for atrocities in Syria, Myanmar, and China. As a scholar and practitioner, I've seen firsthand how vital the legal developments Andy mentioned are, from the law prohibiting and criminalizing genocide and crimes against humanity and other atrocities to the criminal tribunals empowered to enforce and apply that law, holding perpetrators accountable and bringing some measure of justice to victims. From Nuremberg's foundations to the international tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, created by the UN Security Council, to the International Criminal Court, to domestically based hybrid courts that combine national and international lawyers in countries emerging from conflict, as in Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and elsewhere, to specialized national war crimes chambers and justice processes within countries. These developments in the law and in justice mechanisms over the last 75 years are hugely significant. Yet none of this was inevitable. On the contrary, these developments in law and justice mechanisms depended on the relentless determination, advocacy, and tireless efforts of victims and survivors, of skilled lawyers and diplomats, of NGOs, supportive governments, of researchers and scholars, of people around the world standing up to say, these atrocities are unacceptable and they must stop. The struggle for justice continues, and the need for tireless work and relentless determination is especially vital in facing the challenges today in Syria, Myanmar, and China. Each of these situations, of course, are unique and complex with very particular challenges to stopping further atrocities, holding perpetrators to account, and providing justice to victims. Yet despite many differences, let me flag three common features that stand out. First, in each case, the regimes themselves and individuals within them are actively committing horrific atrocity crimes against their own people, as the panelists will discuss. And each regime has resisted outside pressure and repressed internal justice advocates. Secondly, many avenues for accountability are constrained or blocked. The UN Security Council is blocked by one or more permanent members from taking decisive action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court either is not available or, in the case of Myanmar, limited to only some crimes, leading to the third point, a question which the panelists will address. Are there effective, innovative responses that can make a difference? Are there coalitions, forms of pressure, and practical measures to stop atrocities? Are there avenues to pursue meaningful justice and accountability? Each of our panelists brings incredible experience, knowledge, and wisdom to the challenging situations they will discuss, and their full bios are online. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce each of them briefly in the order they will speak. Beth Van Schaack, who will focus on Syria, is a distinguished scholar and beloved professor at Stanford Law School. Beth served in government as deputy to the ambassador at large in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the US State Department during the Obama administration, and I was pleased to follow in her footsteps in that position. Beth worked tirelessly on Syria, and she's the author of an excellent new book, Imagining Justice for Syria. Beth also serves on the editorial board of Just Security, where she is a prolific and insightful writer. Tom Andrews, who will focus on Myanmar, is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, appointed to this position by the UN Human Rights Council. In this vital role, he has worked tirelessly on behalf of the people of Myanmar, mobilizing global attention and advocating for effective action in response to the ongoing repression, violence, and atrocities. A former member of Congress from the great state of Maine, Tom has years of experience running national advocacy organizations, running a consulting practice in which he has engaged with parliamentarians and human rights and democracy advocates from around the world. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce Param-Preet Singh, who will focus on China and the Uyghurs. Pam is a leading justice expert at Human Rights Watch, where she is associate director of their International Justice Program. Pam has wide-ranging expertise in forging paths for justice at the national and international levels for victims of atrocities, with advocacy and on-the-ground experience in numerous countries across many continents. She brings a deep understanding of the challenges, possibilities, and strategies for advancing justice and accountability in very tough situations. We'll hear from each panelist for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a discussion among the panelists, and we'll be opening it up for Q&A from the audience. And as Andy mentioned, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A function. And without further ado, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Beth Van Schaack.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Jane. Thanks so much for including me in this tremendous gathering in honor of Professor Samuel Dash. While I didn't know Professor Dash personally, obviously his enormous contributions to this field are really legendary. I wish we could be together in person to honor him, but I'm so pleased that so many of you has decided to join here online. As is well known, and as Jane mentioned in her introductory remarks, the situation in Syria poses an acute, and some might even say existential, challenge to the system of international justice and the international community's commitment to that system. Virtually every international crime known to humankind that's within our international penal code have been committed in and around Syria. We have deliberate, indiscriminate, and disproportionate attacks, unrelenting siege warfare, the misuse of conventional, unconventional, and improvised weapon systems, the denial of humanitarian aid, sexual violence, including against Yazidi women who've been trafficked from Iraq, and also against men who are in detention, industrial-grade torture in a web of clandestine torture chambers. Thousands of Syrians are still missing, the victims of enforced disappearances, and the long-standing taboo against chemical weapons has been repeatedly flouted. The violence in the region has contributed to the biggest exodus of refugees since World War II. The Syrian battle space has been a crowded one. Obviously, the regime of President al-Assad stands accused as the main culprit, but members of the opposition have not escaped censure and have also committed war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity. Obviously, there's no equivalency there, but we cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that many elements within the opposition have also devolved in terms of their commitment to international humanitarian law. The emergence of the Islamic State within the conflict actually triangulated the violence and that brought even more alarming levels of harm to civilians. And then, of course, the involvement of Western powers on opposite sides of this conflict, at once adversaries and also allies against ISIL, have complicated events on the ground and generated new harms and risks to civilians. And finally, we now have to add Turkey into the mix, particularly once President Trump announced the redeployment or withdrawal of US troops. So the crime base here is so enormous and the pool of potential defendants so voluminous that existing institutions cannot adequately respond to this. The crisis also marks the abject failure of the international system of peace and security erected after World War II. Again, as Jane mentioned in her remarks, the Security Council has been almost entirely incapacitated by the propensity of Russia to wield its veto against nearly any coercive measure that might have been contemplated of any consequence, including legal accountability against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And so as a result, actors within and without the United Nations have endeavored to find inventive ways around this geopolitical impasse and to move the imperative of accountability forward. One area where we've seen a lot of positive development and high degrees of investment by the international community is around documentation of international crimes. We have a whole host of new institutions, including a commission of inquiry coming out of the Human Rights Council, but also a new investigative mechanism created by the General Assembly, flexing its muscles in the face of debility at the Security Council. This new mechanism, we call it the IIIM, has been gathering not just crime-based data and information, but also creating dossiers on potential perpetrators that it can then share with any prosecutorial authorities that are able to move forward. We also have several fact-finding missions and investigative bodies coming out of the OPCW, which normally is devoted to tracking the use of chemical weapons, but has been repurposed to create a stronger accountability angle. There's also multiple non-governmental organizations working, some very much at the grassroots level, citizen journalists collecting information, using their cell phones essentially, all the way up to very sophisticated collectives of former war crimes investigators who are also developing information, dossiers, analytical briefs, and then sharing them with any prosecutorial authorities with the jurisdiction to be able to move forward. So what we're seeing is this really interesting partnership between multilateral organizations, grassroots organizations, national prosecutorial authorities, and advocates working together to try and push the accountability system forward. Now, although we've had a lot of investment in accountability, in documentation, we haven't seen the same investment in building institutions or in empowering institutions. The ICC, as Jane mentioned, has been blocked by the propensity of Russia to use its veto to prevent a referral that was organized by France and joined by a number of states. Almost a third of the UN states had joined that effort, but Russia exercised its veto. There are some novel theories for how the ICC could operate using its nationality jurisdiction, for example, against foreign fighters who have flocked to the region to join the fight. But at the moment, the prosecutor has declined to move forward on the grounds that the basis for jurisdiction is simply too narrow at this point. Even if we could, however, have activated the ICC, one wonders whether it's the ideal forum to deal with a crime base of this magnitude. I have argued, and others have, that what is necessary really in this case is an ad hoc tribunal. I think many assumed that when the ICC was created, it would obviate the need to create additional ad hoc tribunals that were devoted to particular conflict situations. But when you have a crime base so enormous and so complex as the one in Syria, we really do, I think, need a dedicated institution that could work in partnership with national authorities in Syria in the event that there's ever a political transition, but if not in Syria, then with national authorities working in Europe and elsewhere in the region who can exercise some form of extraterritorial jurisdiction over events happening in Syria. Now, the previous ad hoc tribunals have been formed either in the Security Council or with the consent of the territorial state. Obviously, neither of those contingencies is available here. And so there are some very novel proposals floating around that haven't yet developed the diplomatic traction needed to move to the true building stage, but they're available on paper and there are no legal impediments to these. And these proposals would essentially involve recreating the Nuremberg Tribunal. States that are either particularly implicated or very supportive could create some sort of a treaty regime where they could pool their jurisdictional competencies, provide voluntary contributions, all sorts of in-kind assistance. This could be a decentralized institution, a sort of pop-up war crimes tribunal that could operate in areas where perpetrators and victims are found now. States could refer matters to them that if they're unable to prosecute them domestically, and this tribunal could operate as the decentralized, but nonetheless supported, internationally supported institution. As I mentioned, it's available, the blueprints, but we don't yet have the political will to move forward. What has happened instead is that domestic courts have stepped into the void. And now we're seeing the reinvigoration of universal jurisdiction, particularly in Europe, places like Germany that are pursuing really difficult cases, but they're doing so with great success, as it turns out. And a number of these cases have been facilitated by developments in the field. First, the incorporation of international crimes into domestic penal codes, in part occasioned by the ratification of the ICC statute, robust regimes of mutual legal assistance, greater cooperation between dedicated war crimes units across the globe, the formation of joint investigative units between prosecutorial authorities working domestically, and the inexorable integration of European criminal justice systems. Now, while we can cheer this development, we have to concede that these cases are still episodic and opportunistic. And as the cases are moving forward, they're really not representative of the true harm that's happening in Syria. Most of those who have been prosecuted have been members of opposition forces because regime members simply haven't traveled to Europe. There are some exceptions to that general rule, but we're not seeing comprehensive justice coming out of domestic courts. I just want to touch briefly before closing on civil cases, cases that don't involve the imposition of criminal charges, but instead offer victims the opportunity to receive compensants and also to tribunals the opportunity to adjudge state responsibility rather than individual criminal responsibility. In the old days, the International Court of Justice was not considered a human rights institution necessarily, but no longer. We're seeing increasingly states willing to activate the so-called World Court and accuse their co-sovereigns, other states, of breaching their customary international law or their treaty obligations in the human rights realm. The Netherlands and Canada have thus initiated proceedings against Syria under the Convention Against Torture, in responding to the vast network of torture that's happening, torture institutions, both formal and informal, that have been established by the Assad regime around the country. At least 12,000 individuals we know of have died within Syrian prisons, and that number is probably woefully short. That is one effort happening at the ICJ. In domestic courts, it's generally quite difficult to sue states because they enjoy sovereign immunity. But the United States has a Sovereign Immunity Act that actually creates a very important exception for state sponsors of terrorism. And Syria has been so designated since the 1980s, given its depredations in the region. And so the family of the famed war correspondent Marie Colvin were able to sue Syria under that exception to sovereign immunity and win a $300 million judgment against the state of Syria. Now, the asymmetry of this result is really striking. We have a US citizen that's able to activate the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, whereas millions of Syrians are still suffering with no meaningful access to justice. So it's a good news story, but also really reveals the limitations of the system. So all told, the Syrian situation exemplifies two countervailing trends. On the one hand, we have the development of really robust new investigative methods within the international community. At the same time, though, we have a dearth of international justice institutions that are able to utilize and activate this information that has been unearthed, and in some cases literally unearthed, for the benefit of justice. So if Syrian victims are to enjoy any measure of accountability, the international community has to better align these two trajectories in the direction of justice. I really look forward to hearing from my fellow co-panelists and to our discussion after the fact.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that tour de force. That was really, really informative and gives us a lot to think about. I'll now turn it over to Tom Andrews.
Thank you very much, Jane, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is a great honor for me to be here today and to be participating in this panel of esteemed, knowledgeable people who really understand the subject very, very well, as we obviously have just heard from Beth. And what I'm going to try to do is touch on some of the major issues and what has been and developments within Myanmar. And what has been happening outside of Myanmar, and to see and give kind of a summary of where we are and where I think we need to be, and then hold off on that as much as possible so that we can have a discussion and have some good back and forth. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar with the Special Rapporteur system, I am in the United Nations, but I'm not of the United Nations. In other words, I am an independent voice And the UN, in their infinite wisdom, decided that, well, look, we need perspective and analysis and recommendations that come from not necessarily within the United Nations bureaucracy, but from outside. And so we'll establish this network of independent experts and others who have some very important perspective on issues relating to, in this case, human rights. And then we'll implore them into the process of coming up with UN policy. So that's what I do. And frankly, when I started this, which was last year, my term as Special Rapporteur, I really thought that I was going to be amassing more miles, frequent flyer miles that would allow me to go to Mars and back first class. But of course, that hasn't happened. And I've been conveying my reports and my research and my recommendations and presentations largely in this forum through this medium. So I'm glad that we're able to use this medium to engage with one another. And certainly what we find in Myanmar is that this medium has been very, very important. For me to get access to a wide range of individuals who are on the front line of this crisis, to get their perspective, for them to share with one another, for a record to be taken, both photographs and video, of the horror that is being inflicted on the people of Myanmar every day. We have an enormous access to records, and we can use various steps to verify the various recorded evidence that we're compiling. But at the same time, the junta, the military junta, can use the same technology to become a even more repressive police state or surveillance state. So, and of course, they can shut on and off access to the internet at will. And so it becomes both a plus and a minus. I'm going to assume that everyone knows the basic contours of what has happened in Myanmar, a coup d'etat on the 1st of February. It took many of us by surprise. I want to just say, in the interest of transparency, my judgment can be suspect, because I told virtually everyone who asked me about the prospect of a coup. I said, no, there's no way it's going to happen, because the constitution of Myanmar was crafted by these very same generals who would commit the coup. It has given so much power and so much so incredible access to the natural resources and the wealth of those natural resources, makes them virtually unaccountable to anyone. So why would an entity that has so much power and has some legitimacy, because they can claim that they're on the way toward a full-fledged democracy, why would they want to interrupt that? Well, of course, they did, because it wasn't enough. And so now we have a crisis that is becoming even more so. And the topic of our panel, Envisioning Accountability for Victims of Atrocity, the bad news is that the number of victims have increased daily. It's just a horrible reality that whenever I meet or speak with anyone to give them an update of the situation in Myanmar, those numbers increase rapidly. And as we've seen on the ground, the response to the opposition has gone from basically sitting back and allowing very, very large demonstrations to happen all across the country, uniting Myanmar in ways I have never seen before. People from all socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, religions. It's just been remarkable to see. So at first, a hands-off approach, then to the deployment of water cannons and rubber bullets, all the way to most recently when the junta used state television to warn young people that if they go onto the streets, they could be shot in the head. In other words, shoot to kill orders clearly are being issued. And as a result of that, we're seeing casualties increase tragically, significantly. Over 560 people have lost their lives in these conflicts. We've seen the assault on people, not just those that are involved in marches and opposition tactics of various kinds, but those just at home, that we see troops now being deployed from police forces now to these hardened troops that come from the border areas, now being deployed into cities, and then walking through suspected neighborhoods that house those who are sympathetic to the opposition, and destroying property, randomly shooting into people's homes, And as a result of this, the number of children who have been killed continues to rise. Over 44 children as of yesterday had been killed by these forces, and over 2,600 people have been arbitrarily detained. Not only, of course, the president of Myanmar and the state council, Aung San Suu Kyi, but people of all walks of life, in which a knock on the door comes usually at 3 or 4 in the morning. People are taken away. The families don't know where they are. They don't know what they've been charged with. They don't know how to reach them. They don't know their safety. So this reign of terror continues throughout all of Myanmar, all over the country in various ways. It is just an extraordinary hell that has been inflicted on the people of Myanmar. The other side of this, of course, is this remarkable opposition movement that has grown up from the grassroots to an extraordinary, sophisticated, focused, creative, and tenacious movement of the most courageous people I've ever seen. And many of these are young people. Generation Z is in the forefront of the various tactics that have been deployed, and through the civil disobedience movement that has been engaged, we have seen a remarkable, effective opposition, unified opposition to this junta. It is basically grinding the economy to a halt. So we have that movement inside the country. What we need is a movement outside of the country that can join with them to engage in collaborative tactics that can bring the pressure to bear from inside and outside on this of this regime. And so we have, as Beth has been referring to, we have enormous challenges in this respect. The UN Security Council has taken Myanmar up on 3 different occasions. At no occasion have they actually engaged in any kind of action. In light of that, we need to look creatively at alternatives for nations who do agree that sanctions, that an arms embargo, that accountability mechanisms have to be put in place for those willing to stand with and for the people of Myanmar. We can't afford to allow the inaction of the Security Council to be an excuse for inaction from the international community. What we need to have are these nations who are willing to join together in the toughest sanctions that we can possibly apply to the junta, and I can go into some of those in detail later, but to coordinate, secondly, these sanctions. There are 40 different regimes of sanctions that exist around the world of various kinds. We need to unify them and connect them into a coherent whole that has the maximum impact on the junta. The same thing would apply to an arms embargo, unified, coordinated arms embargo. And if it can't be done through a formal mechanism of the United Nations, one of them, besides the Security Council, would be United Nations General Assembly session, using the vehicle of an emergency special session to convene these countries and develop these coordinated approaches. But if that isn't possible, then we can still coordinate these nations through an emergency special session to link these strategies together into a coherent whole. Let me say in the few minutes I have remaining that I have been so honored to see and work with and engage with those extraordinary individuals on the front lines of this opposition movement. They are now transforming that opposition movement into a movement of governance in which a special council that is representing those who have been elected to Parliament is now fully engaged. And now there's a process of this network of various groups and individuals who are working in opposition to come together to form the outline of a unity government. A charter has been established to take us from where we are now to that unity government, and that we're hopeful that we're going to watch this process, this creative process, come together within Myanmar to establish an interim unity government, including not only those inside of the major cities, but those ethnic nationalities around the country, in a unified approach to addressing this crisis. When that happens, I'm very, very hopeful that we can engage the international community to not only not recognize the illegal junta that's in control right now of the country, but to recognize this unity government as it begins to move forward and coalesce those who are willing and able to work for peace in Myanmar. That final word, I just want to say that there are those who believe that armed engagement is going to be necessary. I've spoken with many of them, and if you lost your brother or your father or your sister or your mother to some of this violence, you too would want to have a very strong reaction, including an armed reaction. But that would be an absolute disaster. I am calling for opposition to continue to engage in this peaceful movement so as to avoid maximum loss of life and to build and strengthen the unity of an international community working together in concert with those who are committed to peaceful opposition. And with those words, I will say thank you once again for inviting me. It's a great treat to be with you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And all of us and the people of Myanmar are so fortunate to have you in this incredibly important role as UN Special Rapporteur, bringing so much energy and experience and wisdom to this incredibly important and challenging situation. So thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Pam Singh from Human Rights Watch, who will talk about China and the situation with the Uyghurs. Pam.
Thanks so much, Jane. And thanks very much to the conference organizers for inviting me to participate. I'm really thrilled to be on a panel with such impressive company. I want to start just by giving a brief thumbnail sketch of the Chinese government's brutal repression in Xinjiang for those who may not be as familiar, just to help explain the challenge that we're facing and to contextualize the different paths that I'll also present. So since at least 2016, Beijing has instituted a strike hard campaign in Xinjiang province, which is a province in northwestern China. And basically this campaign has been the springboard for the Chinese government's mass arbitrary detention, torture, surveillance, forced labor, and mistreatment of more than 1 million Turkic Muslims, also known as the Uyghurs. Even children are targets of this campaign. Chinese authorities have kept countless children of those detained in state-run child welfare institutions and boarding schools without parental consent or access. And here's what's even scarier. The Chinese government uses big data to subject 12 million Uyghurs to suffocating levels of surveillance, effectively turbocharging its ability to select them for possible detention. And finally, there are credible reports about Beijing's destruction of cemeteries and cultural heritage sites in Xinjiang, which signal a broader effort to erase the region's cultural history. This threat of erasure has contributed to concerns that the Chinese government may be committing genocide. And while the focus of my remarks today is really on addressing the situation in Xinjiang, I also want to flag that the Chinese government's repression is felt beyond the borders of Xinjiang too. Beijing has manipulated UN review processes and has harassed and intimidated human rights defenders from China, UN human rights experts and staff, and has tried to block the participation of independent civil society overall in the UN system. And outside of the UN, the Chinese government's growing influence with governments, technologies, universities, and corporations has weakened the effectiveness of the multilateral system. And by that, I mean the alliance of governments to unite around a common goal as a check on its repressive ambitions. But there are possibilities for change. There's mounting global concern for the Chinese government's brutal rights record, including in Xinjiang. And there are a couple of examples of this. In October of 2020, so just this past October, a cross-regional group of 39 countries issued a stinging public rebuke of the government's widespread human rights violations in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet, up from 27 countries that joined a similar statement just a few months earlier in Geneva. And just as anecdotally, I can also share that, when I was doing advocacy in October of 2019, so just over a year ago, the idea that there would be 39 countries joining such a statement seemed so far-fetched and outlandish. And the fact that just 1 year later it was possible, I think, is an indication of just how much that concern has grown over the past year. And while I won't touch on it here, last month, the US, the EU, the UK, and Canada worked together and each imposed sanctions on Chinese officials for human rights abuses in Xinjiang. So all of these steps together challenge Beijing's longstanding assumption of impunity because of its economic and diplomatic might. And governments are essentially taking notice and are taking steps to push back. But now the challenge is to really leverage this concern that happens in bits and pieces across the UN system and leverage it into some kind of mechanism to reflect the ongoing UN scrutiny of China's rights record. And what would that do? So durable UN scrutiny would create a much needed platform for states to regularly share their concerns about Beijing's repressive policies in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And it would also create an umbrella under which the UN member states could work together to effectively push back against the Chinese government's efforts to weaken the human rights pillar. And in this way, governments could work together to strengthen the very system of multilateralism that's currently under attack. So now that I've gone through what the problem is, I'm going to run through a few possible paths to create this sustained UN scrutiny, which in our view, as I said, is really the linchpin to focus everyone's efforts on a common goal. I'll refer to them, I've anecdotally referred to them as the gold, silver, and bronze options, Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, but it's not meant to be a hierarchy because I could also see these different paths as being mutually reinforcing depending on how the political situation evolves. So let me start first with the gold standard, Plan A, and that's creating a UN monitoring and reporting body. So this suggestion actually came from 50 independent UN rights experts, which together they wrote a letter in June of 2020, and they urged the Human Rights Council to urgently establish an independent body that would, quote, closely monitor, analyze, and report on the human rights situation in China. Now, Beijing has said that it welcomes a visit to Xinjiang by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet. But the thing is, her request for unfettered access, which is key to its credibility and is typical for country visits, it's been outstanding for more than 2 years. Until now, Chinese authorities, while they've allowed visits, they've been highly choreographed. So visits by diplomats and journalists are very closely surveilled, so there's no independent monitoring possible. Independent observers, they can't speak to victims and witnesses of abuses, or even ordinary people without fear of reprisals. And in fact, it's the very nature of the Chinese government's resistance to any kind of independent scrutiny shows exactly why it's urgent to create this credible UN mechanism with the backing of UN member states. Because the political cost of denying access to such a body is much higher than just simply stalling the Human Rights Commissioner for years on end. And the truth is the UN may never get access to Xinjiang, but that's okay because UN probes in Myanmar and North Korea have shown that you don't need access to deliver a comprehensive, credible, and heavy-hitting report. So how do we get there? Well, to make this happen, it's really just a question of math. You need at least a majority in the Human Rights Council. And the more states from different regions, the better. But we don't have the numbers quite yet. It's also more complicated now because China, as of January 1st, is a member of the Human Rights Council, but we're working on it. And I do think that still remains a possibility, even if it is at this present moment an uphill challenge. So that brings me to another option, the silver option, or Plan B, and that's an interstate complaint under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So here's what you need to know about that. China acceded to the CERD in 1981. So it is a member, and in August of 2018, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, so that's essentially the body of independent experts that monitors its implementation, expressed alarm about the Chinese government's discriminatory treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and issued 8 recommendations to ensure compliance with the CERD. So a government, or better yet, a group of governments, could build on the committee's concern about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang to file a formal complaint before the committee using the interstate complaints mechanism procedure. It's outlined in Articles 11 to 13 of the CERD, which I won't go through in detail now, but as a point of reference, it's pretty clearly laid out. And China doesn't have a reservation on those provisions, so it's fair game to try to hold China to account. So what are the pros of this approach? Well, it's not a UN-backed, fully sort of multilateral UN investigation. It would provide an opportunity to publicly challenge the Chinese government's policies using a multilateral treaty that China has ratified. it would also create a path for an independent international body to develop a comprehensive factual record about abuses against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So in a way, it would add to this sort of political pressure to create something more robust, building off of the findings of fact of the Third Commission. And that larger, what I'd refer to as the gold standard, I mean, so you could see that this UN, the Interstate Commission or the Interstate Mechanism, the factual ground point that it would establish would create the pressure, as I said, to create this more comprehensive review that would include not just a factual record, but also recommendations to member states. And those recommendations to member states would in effect seize the entire UN system and make it all member states' responsibility in a very clear way to take further steps to address the situation in Xinjiang. So now I want to get to the third option, which I refer to as the bronze, is the International Court of Justice and seeking an advisory opinion. So as I mentioned, China, it's been very clever about keeping itself from the reach of the International Court of Justice. It's through its reservations in various treaties and conventions, it's basically closed any possibility for formal ICJ scrutiny. But under Article 65 of the ICJ statute, the court can give advisory opinions on questions of public international law. Now, these opinions aren't binding, but the process of seeking clarity from the UN's highest court can bring political weight and pressure to bear on the states with an interest in the underlying question. So how could this option come about? Well, the most obvious response is that the UN General Assembly can make a request, but that requires soliciting the necessary support from the GA's 193 members. And we run into similar difficulties, although I think that it's perhaps a little bit more fluid in terms of state support for China. But we run into similar problems as we do with the Human Rights Council and creating a UN investigation through that body. But there's another option outside of the General Assembly. UN organs and specialized agencies can seek advisory opinions on legal questions arising within the scope of their activities. So one option could be this. Given the Chinese government's well-documented destruction of cultural heritage sites in Xinjiang, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, could seek an opinion, possibly looking at this destruction as violations of the CERT. So just to wrap up, I want to be clear that by laying out these paths, I'm not articulating a prescription, but I do think it's important to explore what's legally and procedurally possible, because in this way, civil society, like Human Rights Watch, like other groups, working together with governments, can really help the UN system inch closer to holding the Chinese government to account for abuses against the Uyghurs. We have the tools to do this. We have the tools to hold the Chinese government to account. And at this point, it's really a question of building the political will and momentum to use them, not just to protect the Uyghurs, but the entire UN human rights system. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Pam. And I'd like to invite all the panelists to come back on screen so we can begin a conversation. Terrific. What an excellent group of presentations. And there were a number of common themes. And I'd just like to mention two. One was that existing mechanisms, particularly the UN Security Council, is blocked or constrained. The sort of more familiar path to try to get collective international action in response to these situations is really, really almost, blocked, other than, I guess there was a presidential statement on Myanmar a few, recently, but still. Nevertheless, the second theme is that there are innovative workarounds, right? There are mechanisms, institutions, including in the UN system, the Human Rights Council, which only needs a majority to create a mechanism, possibilities of resorting to the International Court of Justice, human rights bodies, that there are an array of tools, array of mechanisms that can be used creatively and innovatively to press and shine the spotlight and to mobilize, to gather evidence in these very pressing situations. So that's the good news. And related to this good news is, it seems to me, all of you identified coalitions that include not only governments, but mobilized civil societies, ordinary citizens seeking the dignity and the participation in governance that they are entitled to under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments. So those are the kind of tensions I see in the themes that I see emerging from what all of you have said. And I guess building on that, we have a new administration that's engaged on these issues, that cares about issues of justice and accountability. And I'm wondering if there are particular recommendations you have for what the Biden administration should be doing on the particular crises that you're all expert in. And maybe a related question is, what about the private sector? Are there other actors that we haven't really talked about that can serve a constructive role, can put pressure in trying to achieve some measure of justice and indeed some measure of prevention of continuing atrocities? So I'll just put those on the table and welcome all of you to respond.
Well, maybe we'll stay in the order that we went, and I'm happy to go first and just throw some ideas out. So the U.S. government has been really good about supporting documentation efforts. We've funded an organization called the SJAC, the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, I think is the C, CJA, which is the Commission on International Justice and Accountability. Both of these are doing really good documentation. We haven't been particularly engaged in the last 4 years on the accountability front. I think some of that funding continued just through normal momentum. So I could imagine the US convening some sort of a summit to think about accountability models for Syria and to really give serious consideration to backing this pooled jurisdiction idea, because the US could play a leadership role here. We were obviously in that position in Nuremberg, and so bringing that legacy forward and applying it to the Syrian context, I think is a really concrete thing the United States could do. We have that convening power that we have not exercised in the last 4 years, and so get back that muscle memory, I think, is something that the Biden administration could really take on in the Syrian context. I'm sure they're just really, in fact, I read an article recently, and I think it was Foreign Policy Magazine, saying that people are just sort of baffled by what to do, like what can we do in the Syrian context? And here is a very concrete pathway that the Biden administration could take.
And on the corporate side, maybe we'll do the Biden administration first, and then we'll come back. Okay, Tom.
Well, first of all, the president was very quick out of the gate right after the coup, condemned the coup and said some very good things, and established an initial round of sanctions on individuals who were responsible for the coup, and then some smaller businesses, some of the gem companies. It then evolved, it moved forward. Of course, there were many people, and again, this is where Pam's point of political will is so important. There was a range of organizations, large and small, and including Pam's, that were calling for the administration to do more, both in terms of increasing sanctions, but then also the idea of coordination. And one of the things that the president said right out of the gate was that in addition to sanctions, he wants to play a role in helping to coordinate action by the international community. And I find that this is extremely important because the United States is in a very unique position in order to do this. So week before last, I was before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Asia Subcommittee. We were talking about this, and lo and behold, the State Department comes forward and announces tougher sanctions, not only on individuals and small businesses, but now on business conglomerates within Myanmar. That was an important step forward. But it didn't go so far as to say, okay, we're going to also address the single largest source of revenue for the junta, namely oil and gas revenue. That was not mentioned. The chair of the committee, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, immediately called for that to happen. And again, in terms of political will, not only do we have many organizations calling for these toughened sanctions, but also inside of Myanmar, with respect to oil and gas, over 400 organizations of people within Myanmar have called together for sanctions to be applied on oil and gas as it continues its civil disobedience movement inside of the country. Finally, the coordination role is extremely important, particularly given the challenges that we have with the Security Council. Now, first of all, let me just say, that everyone says, okay, Russia and China would veto anything that was before the Security Council. Well, I haven't done that yet because they never had the opportunity. There has been no resolution for action proposed to the UN Security Council. And in my view, that should happen. And the country should stand up and be counted one way or another. And if they want to veto it or be against it, well, then stand up and explain why. And then that opens up additional mechanisms like the emergency special session of the General Assembly. But I think ultimately what this is going to come down to is nations who care about the people of Myanmar under siege and want to take action, coordinating those steps together. And so I've been calling and urging countries, including the United States, to play a critically important coordinating role, to have an emergency summit for the people of Myanmar among those countries who are willing and prepared to take action, to join together and develop this kind of coordinated strategies, identifying the baseline of sanctions, baseline of arms embargo elements, and then working in a coordinated fashion to make all of those link together so that it has the greatest possible impact. Last but not least, that exact kind of effort needs to go into place to support the people inside of Myanmar. There's not only a human rights crisis, there's now a humanitarian crisis underway. People are going hungry. There's extremely important for governments of the world to step forward and provide aid, not through the junta, but through CSO, INGOs and CSOs that are providing aid and support to people inside of the country, and for a call for those bordering Myanmar to be prepared to accept the refugees that are coming, both understanding and respecting their international obligations to welcome these refugees, literally running for their lives from Myanmar, but also working with the international community, be prepared for them coming into over their borders so that they get this aid and support that they need.
Great, thank you. Pam, same question.
It's a good one. I do think that having the U.S., first of all, re-engage in the Human Rights Council has been huge, just in terms of creating a sort of rallying opportunity for other governments to step up their expression of concern. And so we're really, not just in Geneva, but also in New York, really looking forward to and have benefited already from a reinvigorated U.S. government that's very committed to human rights and to, as I said, holding China to account, or the Chinese government to account. At the same time, I think it's very important that the U.S. understands, and I think they do, but that leadership sometimes requires leading from behind. And actually having the U.S. as the front runner on all things, pushing back against the Chinese government can actually be harmful because it is seen through a political lens as opposed to a human rights lens. And so really strengthening alliances with other governments, bringing in, outside of the usual suspects, from Europe, Canada, but looking at countries in Latin America, looking at African countries to try to bring them into the fold, to create that sense of, a really robust alliance of governments expressing concern around the world. And then, I think by extension too, I think that what we're looking forward, or what we hope to see, is the government really extending its diplomatic reach, outside of these multilateral fora, outside of the UN, but in its bilateral relations, for instance, with African governments, to try to fill in the gaps, or rather counteract the growing Chinese government's influence across the African continent. Anecdotally, I can tell you, speaking with smaller African and other Latin American missions who are scared. They're scared of pushing back against China because they rely on them for a lot of infrastructure and financial support. And so I think just thinking about, for the US government to think about how it can effectively realign that balance so that governments can feel that they have the space to vote in accordance with human rights principles, as opposed to towing the Chinese line because of agreements or fear of retaliation if they don't.
These are all very important points that each of you have raised, and I think provide a vision of the many things that the Biden administration could do that could make a meaningful difference in these very tough situations. And I did want to come back to the question of the role of the private sector, because I think that is we have powerful companies, powerful multinationals, tech companies, oil and gas companies, many that have economic engagements and could take action, presumably, to make an impact as well. So I'm interested in each of your situations, what you see as the prospects there for a company that does want to speak out and take action against atrocities.
Yeah, the situation in Syria is somewhat unique because we haven't seen the levels of U.S. investment there that we have in elsewhere. And I think Pam probably has a lot to say about the use of human trafficking and forced labor in the cotton industry and other industries that really are sourced out of Xinjiang, where there's a captive group of laborers there that are being used to good effect for the Chinese bottom line. But in Syria, what we do have is a number of foreign companies remained involved during the war, and they're actually seeing some consequences to that. So there have been criminal investigations open against Holcim Cement Company, for example, which is I think it was a French company, and then it merged with a Swiss company for doing business in Syria, including with ISIL. So there are investigations around the financing of terrorism and support, aiding and abetting crimes against humanity, essentially, and also a company that was providing surveillance equipment to Syria, also the subject of investigation within Europe. And so the Europeans have been really clever about thinking about corporate responsibility from a criminal perspective. And I think that's something that the US has underdeveloped, and I'd like to see some greater investment there. We also have seen tech platforms that are really serving as repositories of potential evidence. Individual citizen journalists are uploading their videos that they're taking from their phone, et cetera. And some of these videos technically violate the terms of service of, say, Twitter or YouTube. And often what happens is these are taken down. And there's now a movement afoot being led by the Berkeley Human Rights Center and others to conceptualize a sort of evidence locker where tech companies could, rather than simply make this information unavailable, take it down, but put it somewhere so that it can be analyzed carefully to make sure that it doesn't show, for example, evidence that could be used in a potential war crimes prosecution. And so trying to work collectively with these tech platforms in order to respect their terms of service, ensure that you don't have ISIL recruitment videos out there, but don't take them offline entirely so that they're not available for future accountability purposes. And then the final thing I would mention is continuing to support and develop tech tools to enable better documentation, safer documentation, so we can potentially take individuals out of the mix and make so they're not so vulnerable to retaliation. And so there are tech companies that are creating, for example, these sensors that can sense airstrikes coming and coordinate the direction those airstrikes might be coming in order to give precious 2 or 3 minute early warning within Syrian communities that are trying to capture, for example, radio transmissions that the Russian pilots are using in order to be able to identify which planes are being associated with which attacks. And the New York Times did a really incredible expose discussing how and showing how all of this can be triangulated in such a way that you can really piece together what happened when a particular hospital, let's say, was hit, and identify which entity in the conflict was responsible for that hospital. And so there are a number of tech companies that are trying to develop these sort of technologies. A couple come to mind, like Hala Systems and Videre Escredere, which creates these little tiny clandestine cameras that people can wear in order to capture things without putting themselves at such great risk. So more investment in these sort of tools would be another positive contribution that the private sector could make.
Great, thank you. Tom.
That's a very good point, particularly with respect to Myanmar. Saving that evidence, taking things down, but saving that evidence is extremely, extremely important. We've been able to track some of the movements of some of these light infantry battalions and so forth just by virtue of their using this technology. Anyway, it's extremely important point. I want to underscore that. Let me just make a couple of comments. First of all, the junta of Myanmar would like everyone to believe that they're impervious to international pressure, that it doesn't matter what these businesses do, multinational corporations, it doesn't matter, they're just going to continue on. It's not true. And the evidence is that the modest reforms that we saw that were overturned in this coup d'etat happened precisely because of pressure, economic pressure, investment pressure. So it does work, it does have an impact, and it's extremely important that this be moving forward in the private and the public sector. Now, there's a relationship here. I personally think that the private sector has an interest in supporting public sector sanctions that could help the companies that want to do the right thing to do the right thing with more security if sanctions existed. So let's take, for example, the oil and gas sector that I had mentioned before. Now, this is the single largest source of revenue flowing into the pockets of the junta. It's an open spigot. Over $1 billion a year flow to the junta just from oil and gas alone. Now, one of the concerns of companies is that, well, we have to abide by a contract. We have legal contractual obligations. So our hands are tied. Well, wait a minute. Who is the contract with? It seems to me that contract was with a legitimate government. And that legitimate government happens to not be in existence. The leaders of that government responsible for that contract are being held hostage. We can't communicate with them. What's happened instead is that they have been taken over by a criminal enterprise that is taking that revenue and instead of using it for the public purposes through a legitimate government, is using it to support and enable its atrocities against the people of Myanmar. So it seems to me that the private sector not only has a moral obligation to stop those revenue flows, but there's a very strong legal argument that can be made that, listen, this is not the deal that we had. The deal that we had with the entity, it no longer exists. And I would, pushing that envelope to a court of law, I think would generate some very interesting results, because I think that argument would be very compelling. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, and I've suggested this to some of our friends in the private sector, if you're concerned, okay, while you move forward in the way we're suggesting, then support sanctions. Go to governments that house you, that have legal responsibility for you as government entities, and ask them to establish sanctions so that you have even further protection in the steps that you want to take. So it seems to me the private sector can play a very important role. The government can play a very important role. And I think working together, they could collectively have a very important role to play in making what the junta now says doesn't matter, but we know from experience matters very much.
Thank you, terrific. And maybe I'll just, Pam, before I get to you, there's a question that was asked by someone involved, a participant. What more could be done with respect to sanctions on Myanmar? Why hasn't the State Department imposed sanctions on oil and gas revenues? What more could they do? It goes directly to Tom's point, and I'm wondering why hasn't more been done by the U.S. on sanctions?
It's a very good question. I think, and I can't speak for the strategy of the administration, but there's a certain logic to say, well, we're going to ramp up sanctions, right? We're going to incrementally apply them as conditions warrant. Our argument is conditions warrant maximum sanctions. Let's not fool around with incrementalism, because we just can't afford to do that. And when I make that argument, so first of all, with respect to oil and gas, Senator Ed Markey has already made a public call for this to happen. So supporting congressional efforts, talking to your member of the House and Senate, say we support full sanctions on oil and gas. We support the full range of sanctions being applied right now. And we support the United States playing a supportive role in coordinating sanctions by those who are willing to do it. That seems to me would be extremely important thing to happen. And listen, there's enormous pressure on the committee representing the Union Parliament in existence right now. There's an organization forming to form an interim government. There's an interim charter in place. In talking to everyone, there is enormous pressure for a military response of some kind. First choice, have the 82nd Airborne, fly over and parachute down into Myanmar. Not going to happen. The second choice is to employ the armed ethnic armies, make them one unified army, and then have them engage. That is just fraught with danger. The way I have described the approach that we've been taking is, on the one hand, let's have strategies and tactics have maximum impact on the junta, minimum impact on innocent people. And if we were to go to that route, I'm afraid the loss of life would be just catastrophic, even more than it is right now, which means that people of Myanmar have to recognize that there's more than just two options. Either we just continue to get assaulted by this horrific junta, or nothing, that nothing happens. We have to convince them with strong, principled, focused action that there is a third way. There's a way that can actually gain some results. We are with them, we stand with them. And this is how we're going to do it, with robust sanctions that are coordinated. But the incremental approach, we need to turn the page from that approach.
Great, thank you. And Pam, the question about the role of the private sector, which with the Olympics coming up is obviously on the mind of many. So I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good question and a pretty complicated one. In some ways, it's very straightforward. In other ways, it's very complicated with respect to Xinjiang. So for those who don't know, Xinjiang actually supplies, it's estimated, about a fifth of the world's cotton. So, it's likely that if you don't already own, you likely did own at one point, cotton that was sourced and produced in Xinjiang. Now, this issue has actually come to the forefront recently in the last couple of weeks, because Nike and H&M, I think they both announced that they weren't going to source their cotton from Xinjiang any longer, in addition to other brands, but those are the most prominent. And they've been subject to retaliation by the Chinese government, both in the form of sort of public rebukes, strong words, but also in boycotts, through the form of boycotts in China. And that's affected their bottom line. I mean, it's not that speaking out isn't without reputational or financial cost for these big brands. But I think that you can see, in a way, this is maybe similar to what Tom was suggesting earlier, the sort of dovetailing of the public and the private, because I think that as there is this growing chorus of concern about what's happening in Xinjiang among governments, that also has an impact of increasing the reputational and financial cost for these companies to not speak out and to not change their practices. And so, it's not that it's not so simple as, well, these companies have pulled out. It's this, it's China. It's not a small country that will take that message lightly. And so I think the extent to which we can, see this, as I said, this growing coordinated chorus of concern, that it does have an impact on the calculations of these brands as to how they want to engage with the Chinese government, and specifically on the question of cotton sourced from Xinjiang, but also, more broadly. I think, Jane, you mentioned the Olympics. That's a really a good opportunity, I think, for governments to show that they don't support Chinese repressive policies in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. And we've actually called for governments, we don't want to penalize athletes who want to compete in the Games in Beijing next year, but governments send low-level representation. There are ways that you can send a message without penalizing those who are competing that would, really contribute to this growing sense of concern and efforts.
Pam, are you done? Or you got muted? Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I am. I muted. I thought that was sufficient.
Yeah, that was very helpful. And I want to encourage members of the audience who have questions to submit them through the Q&A function. And I did want to ask a specific question to Tom, because Tom, the plight of the Rohingya, the crimes against humanity, the genocide against the Rohingya is so dire. And presumably when you started your role, that was your primary focus, and then we had the coup. And I'm just interested in what you are trying to do now with regard to the atrocities against the Rohingya and how their plight is affected by or bound up in the current crisis.
That's a very good question, Jane. And one of the remarkable things and heartening things that I've been experiencing is talking to people or hearing expressions of solidarity from a wide range of people with the Rohingya inside of Myanmar, and even apology. Why weren't we speaking up during those genocidal attacks? And one of the expressions, the National Unity Consultative Council, as I've been mentioning, is working to forge a unity government. And Dr. Sasa, who is the council's representative to the United Nations, he said that he is looking forward to be able to sit down with his brothers and sisters from the Rohingya community to work together in concert with a true unified nation to move forward to address the crises that they're facing. So those are extremely important sentiments. And perhaps there's some incredible light that could be shown at the end of this tunnel through this enormous unity. The Rohingya, meanwhile, are in grave danger. Min Aung Hlaing, who is now running the country, was in charge of the forces that committed those mass atrocity crimes, in Rakhine State, that sent over 750,000 Rohingya running for their lives over the border into Rohingya. He is now running the entire junta. So they're in danger. There are more than 600,000 living in Rakhine State right now. Over 120,000 are living in internment camps that were established years ago, that were supposedly temporary. The others are living in villages that are all surrounded by military forces, the same forces that committed those atrocities against them. So they're in grave danger. Meanwhile, there are 1 million people outside of the country living both in Cox's Bazar, refugee camps in Bangladesh, and now several are in the process of moving to an island, Bhasan Char Island. That is all in the process right now in the form of to provide them with some humanitarian aid. The short answer, Jane, is that the Rohingya crisis continues. They need and deserve the attention of the world on their plight, particularly the 600,000 that are in grave danger right now in Rakhine State, but all of the Rohingya, whether they're in the country or outside of the country. And there is great danger, but also, as I mentioned, great opportunity if we can move forward through this to bring a true unified nation together.
Great. Beth and Pam, I know you've also worked on Myanmar and may have some thoughts to add to this as well. So.
Yeah, just one point I was going to make, and I guess I should have mentioned it in connection with your earlier question, Jane, about what more the U.S. could do. The International Court of Justice is really implicated in all three of these situations and could potentially play a really interesting role here. I mentioned the case involving the Netherlands and Canada against Syria under the Convention Against Torture. Pam mentioned the possibility of an advisory opinion involving what's happening in Xinjiang, either from the General Assembly itself or from one of the constitutive entities within the UN, such as UNESCO. And then in Burma, the Gambia has brought suit under the Genocide Convention in connection with the Rohingya genocide. And the US could back all of these. We deployed under the Trump administration an interdisciplinary team from the Public International Law and Policy Group, PILPG, to do an investigation in Cox's Bazar and elsewhere. They couldn't get into the country, but they were able to speak with diaspora and refugee communities. That information was fed into the State Department and was supposed to undergird some sort of a genocide determination, which, as we know, never materialized. But that information exists, and PILPG has put out a big report, but there's probably underlying data that could be shared, that may have been shared. I don't know whether that has been, but the US could back that effort before the ICJ. Likewise, we have our own sources of information about torture within Syria, in connection with Syria, and also within Xinjiang. And we could be sharing that with entities that are pursuing justice in these environments. I would love one day to see the United States join in one of these sovereign cases before the ICJ. That may be a bridge too far. We have a complicated relationship with the ICJ, although we're participating very actively in some proceedings involving Iran that are, go back to the old days with that respect to that bilateral relationship. But at a minimum, we should be supporting and feeding information into these processes.
Great. Pam, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe just one thing. Just in terms of ICC involvement in Myanmar, there is already an ICC investigation into the forced deportation of the Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh under the theory that the crime was completed in Bangladesh, which is a state party to the ICC. I have seen reports that the sort of loose body of civilian authorities that exists right now, their legal status is a bit unclear, but they have been considering referring the situation in Myanmar to the ICC from February 1st of this year, so the date of the coup, which I think is a really interesting possibility. And leaving aside whether or not that's legally possible, just because it's unclear if they have the authority to do so, I do think that looking at the ICC, extending the ICC's jurisdiction through a self-referral under Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute, and looking back to at least 2016, so bring it into line with the existing ICC investigation to cover the crimes committed against the Rohingya, could be a really powerful message to show that this new Myanmar speaks for everybody and it represents everybody. And it's an opportunity to, atone for the crimes of the past, but to also hold the military to account for not just crimes committed during the coup, but crimes against humanity, possibly genocide against the Rohingya, and also other ethnic minorities, because this murderous military has, it's inflicted its wrath on minorities in various provinces of Myanmar. And this is, again, an opportunity to bring, by showing that the government speaks for everyone and represents everyone, to not just say that with words, but to show it through actions by, again, as I said, extending the jurisdiction backwards.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. And the idea of inclusive governance that welcomes everybody and treats everybody with dignity and respect, these are hugely important objectives that I know all of you are working for. And there's a question we have from a member of the audience, an LLM student, who has a question for Tom, which is, what is your opinion of the recent publication of the Federal Democracy Charter by CRPH, as it is receiving some criticism from the people? And what do you think that they should do more to form the national unity government?
Well, I've seen snippets in English. I'm still waiting to get a fully accurate translation of the charter. But listen, it is a step. It's a transparent step forward that, of course, can be improved upon, strengthened, built upon. But the idea that you are laying out a framework openly, that people can criticize, can identify flaws with, make recommendations for, on the process toward a national unity consultative council, I think is a very, very important thing and a very, very important step forward. So yes, I think some CSOs have criticized it for being not as inclusive as it could be. That's a legitimate concern, and I think this is exactly why transparency and openness is so important, so that these views can be taken into account. It's why I congratulate those that are putting this together for putting it up front. But there's some very interesting, encouraging things that are coming from those that are seeking to achieve this unity, including revisiting the Myanmar's position with the International Court of Justice, for example, for obvious reasons. And to sign the Rome Statute and to become a party of the International Criminal Court, so that it can then, as Pam is suggesting, move forward for justice for those who have been denied it through the International Criminal Court. So all of these elements are now being identified and are surfacing. Yes, let's be critical when we need to. Let's be encouraging of the transparency of this process. And working together, let's see if we can move this forward.
Great. We have another question from our audience, which I think all of you will be interested in addressing, which is this: what is the importance of the nomenclature of genocide as opposed to crimes against humanity or atrocities in regard to U.S. or UN action in these countries? Beth, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, thank you. I have argued, and I think others have as well, and many would agree, that from the perspective of what should the international community be doing, what should the Biden administration be doing, it's of no moment, this distinction between genocide and crimes against humanity. If a situation rises to the level at which either of these crimes is being committed, that really behooves the international community to think about the most robust measures possible in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of isolating the regime and perpetrators, thinking about accountability, helping refugees, thinking about the whole range of mobilizing the private sector to pull out or to put restraints on the ability of these regimes to profit, et cetera. All of that should be in the toolkit, regardless of how we legally characterize the offenses. They're of equal gravity. That said, genocide does have a very particular definition under international law, and it's crimes against humanity in some respects are kind of a lesser included offense, because what distinguishes genocide from crimes against humanity is the intent to destroy the group, whatever that protected group is, in whole or in part. And in all of these situations, Syria, somewhat less so, but certainly Xinjiang and in Burma, Myanmar, we have a ethno-religious minority that is the subject of extreme persecution from the governing regime. And so it's crimes against humanity at a minimum, but we may also have genocide. What does set genocide slightly apart is that there is a treaty that defines the crime, and it's called the treaty. It's a convention on the prevention and punishment. So it's not just the punishment of the crime after the fact. There's some obligation to prevent. Now, it's very amorphous, the language in that treaty. It's particularly anodyne. It doesn't really say what states are supposed to do, but it certainly puts an obligation on states to think about what more they can be doing to engage in preventative action. And so that is one area where having a treaty and having the label of genocide apply can be helpful. It also grounds jurisdiction for the ICJ. Now, there is an effort afoot, I think it was mentioned in the opening remarks, to create a parallel crimes against humanity treaty. We have a definition. We have draft articles that have come out of the International Law Commission, and now that's sitting in front of the General Assembly. And so we need a real civil society effort to move forward to make sure that the international community doesn't drop the ball on this. That would fill an important gap, and then it would create also a pathway to the ICJ and also preventative obligations when crimes against humanity are at issue. Because we've gotten to the point now where something like ethnic cleansing is now a defense to genocide, because the Myanmar regime could say, oh, no, we're not committing genocide. It's just ethnic cleansing. And that is not a tenable place to be as an international community.
Pam or Tom, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Well, it becomes relevant in the United States in that the State Department spent an enormous amount of resources and time documenting what happened in Rakhine State in 2017, and came out with a report on what happened. But what it didn't do was it didn't define it. It didn't come to a conclusion. And so we've had subsequent administrations say, well, we're looking at this closely, et cetera, but there has not been a genocide determination, notwithstanding the extraordinary amount of evidence that was presented back by this investigation. So it's a relevant point. And Congress right now is now pushing the administration to just decide one way or the other. Is it genocide or is it not genocide? Make that determination based upon the facts. And there's a real, again, movement going forward. So in terms of creating political will, if people want to advance this position, that is to say the United States should be recognizing these atrocities for what they are, genocide, then here's another vehicle for that to happen.
Pam?
Maybe just to close and to echo something that Beth said earlier with respect to the Genocide Convention. I mean, I think that despite the fact that the convention itself is somewhat vague, it does create a process for adjudication on the question of genocide. And we're seeing that play out with Gambia's genocide case before the ICJ against Myanmar. On the question of China and Xinjiang, again, I'd mentioned earlier that there is a lot of discussion about whether or not what China is doing in Xinjiang constitutes genocide, and there are certain indicators that could reflect an intent to destroy. When you raise that, let's say with a government to say, well, what's your position on this? The response that I've gotten is, well, that's true, but we can't take China to the International Court of Justice because they have a reservation on that provision of the treaty, and that's true. But, and again, this comes back to what Beth was saying, is that the the convention isn't just about the offending state, it's also an obligation shared by all member states to the convention to prevent. And so in terms of escalating the political cost and engaging states to adhere to their international obligations, it does have that added weight and value of really incentivizing governments to speak out and to effectively push back.
So all of you raised the question of prevention, and I did want to focus on this a bit, because often justice and accountability comes after the fact, after the atrocities, years later even, and the victims have suffered, and we obviously would like to prevent atrocities, prevent new victims. And I'm interested if any of you, I know, Beth, you've been involved in the atrocity prevention efforts of the Obama administration. Is this a what have we learned? What can be done better on prevention, sort of getting ahead of crimes and doing more to make sure they don't actually happen, and we don't end up with these situations that are so devastating to victims and survivors?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in these three situations, we're sort of beyond the prevention stage. Obviously, there's ongoing mitigation efforts, and
you can prevent presumably certain things even within an ongoing crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think going forward, the key is to really move this work upstream, I think. Thinking about all of the risk factors that we know about, divisions within society, hate speech that you start seeing, acts of repression that happen against vulnerable groups. We should be on notice when these things are happening and look for ways to empower local communities to respond within their own system, find those local leaders who can be peace builders, who can bring groups together, who can tamp down hate speech, or who can offer really compelling counter speech, who all the sort of make sure that the economic benefits that are being shared. So you're not seeing these economic divisions happening between groups that often underlie these more ideological or race-based or ethnicity-based or religion-based excuses that sort of get piled on top. And so I think pushing this work upstream is really important. And this is where the appointment of Samantha Power as head of the USAID, I think, is going to be really important, because she will bring that prevention lens. And much of that work is more in the development sphere. Once the State Department gets involved, and then certainly once the Pentagon gets involved, it's sort of too late. Things have often devolved to a situation where the options that we have to work with are much more limited. And so we need to see diplomatic measures working together with development measures. And we can do this bilaterally, but we also, I think, could build out the multilateral infrastructure better. We have some special advisors, for example, on the prevention of genocide and on responsibility to protect. And so empowering those offices to use their convening power to bring states together, encouraging other states to create similar atrocities prevention initiatives internally, and to appoint a focal person or a point person who can run that portfolio within those individual governments, working in partnership with others through regional entities and gatherings, et cetera. This has to be done at multiple levels. And so, we have a new opportunity now with the U.S. re-engaging on the multilateral sphere to reinvigorate this atrocities prevention initiative.
I think that's exactly right. And I think we have to look at some of these mechanisms that Beth is referring to, let's say the R2P mechanisms, the various atrocity prevention boards and other mechanisms that exist inside of countries, and then within countries, or with connecting two countries together. And look at those mechanisms in the case of Myanmar as a way to prevent further atrocities. So, there's a network, a wide-ranging network, R2P network. And very often, if you see some of the photographs coming from some of the demonstrations in Myanmar, you'll see people raising the signs, R2P. Where's R2P? Now, the assumption of some of them is that means there's going to be military action. But as we know, R2P is much more than any one particular tactic. It focuses on the responsibility of we as an international community of nations to do everything we can to stop these atrocities from going on, from preventing them, but stopping them from continuing if they're in place. And we can use these mechanisms, I believe, to generate discussion, debate, and then help to create the political will to move forward in the ways that we've been suggesting here of coordinated government action. So I'm hoping that we can, those of us who are looking for opportunities to make a difference, if you've got an R2P mechanism that you're connected with directly or indirectly, let's use those mechanisms to move justice forward for those in Myanmar whose lives are in danger.
Yeah, Pam, do you want to?
Yeah,
I mean, your organization does a lot in this space, so.
We do a lot in this space, and actually my remarks are unsurprisingly aligned with the work that we've been doing. A common thread with all three situations is I think you also have to link
Let's see, Pam, you're a bit frozen.
they have to be respected.
There we go.
Oh, is that?
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Let me try turning off.
You're back.
Is that better? I'll keep my camera off just for a minute while my connection stabilizes. No, but bringing the accountability space together with the importance of respecting freedom of expression, freedom of movement, right to education, cultural rights. I mean, all of these different spheres come together to create that sort of open society where human rights can thrive and are respected. On the other hand, repression thrives on darkness. And what we want is to shine as much light on, the individual. We don't want people to just survive. We want them to thrive. And so how do we create the conditions for that to be possible, to limit the space where these kinds of horrific violations are committed and accountability is necessary?
Well, thank you all so much. We only have a few more minutes left, but I thought since we have a lot of students listening and a lot of members of the general public, it might be nice to end with asking you, what can students do? What can ordinary Americans do who care about these issues? What can they do to contribute over time to advancing justice and accountability?
Yeah, well, the more the merrier is what I say. So take the classes, join organizations, support them financially if you end up on a different pathway, if you end up in the private sector, look for ways to build pro bono into your practice. But for the general public, I think we really need to build a U.S. domestic constituency that cares about these issues. Members of Congress are not hearing enough from the general public, from people who are voting for them. I joined government right after the Coney 2012 movement happened, and it was unbelievable how many calls my office received from members of Congress. Who is this Joseph Coney, and what are we doing about him? They wanted action, they wanted results, and as a result, because there were middle school kids in my little downtown, like holding signs like "Capture Coney," "End the LRA," there were people making phone calls. Parents were calling saying, "My kid is furious about this. What more can we be doing?" We were able to gin up a really comprehensive response to the Lord's Resistance Army that included everything from humanitarian assistance to literally boots on the ground, to supporting the ICC warrants against LRA leadership, et cetera, working with Uganda on their transitional justice measures. And so having that kind of energy around human rights issues is really important. Members of Congress respond to those calls. And so if we all can take a moment out of our day to reach out to your local member of Congress and say that you care about this, you're watching, you want to see the U.S. playing a leadership role here, that can be incredibly helpful to build that energy within the Washington infrastructure.
I remember being in the back of the House chamber when I was in Congress, and we were talking about an issue, a vote that was coming up, and a member was saying, "Boy, I've got to pay attention to this because I'm getting a real strong feedback from my constituency on this issue." And I says, "Really? How many calls?" I've had at least a dozen calls on this issue, was the response. I'll tell you, a concerted, focused effort. It doesn't take a lot of calls to make a difference and to show up with members of Congress, either by calling them, when they're home, engaging with them, but then also with your organizations and your networks, whether academic organizations and networks, faith-based groups, human rights organizations, the whole range. Become actively engaged and encourage those organizations to push this envelope and use their collective weight to do so. The Generation Z are on the front lines of this movement over in Myanmar. It is incredible, the tenacity and courage and creativity that they're showing. They need young people to be standing with them and for them. And I think there's a tremendous range of opportunities for young people to do so.
Great, thank you. Pam.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really great suggestions. I fully align with myself with the other panelists. And just on the subject of the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar, I mean, like Tom, I've been so inspired by their creativity, their persistence, and the peaceful nature of their protests. And if anything, it's actually sparked my thinking about how we as civil society, especially coming from a large organization, how can we infuse our own activism with some of that grassroots energy to extend the reach of what we do beyond just the elite policymakers, which is of course absolutely important because that's where decisions are made. But think about how you can shape the universe of information that influences those decisions. So, go on social media and, get a sense of who are some of the more influential activists, local activists in these situations. Follow them and see what their ideas are, because I think they can speak the most authentically about what the situation requires. I think just amplifying their voices is also really important, just to give them that sense of legitimacy and protection that comes from the recognition of the legitimacy of what they're trying to do, especially in situations like with respect to Xinjiang, where activists are routinely targeted. So I think beyond just everything that Tom and Beth have already said, like really step outside and think about how the people who are involved in this frontline work, how can you support them? And oftentimes, I think in their social media feeds, they'll tell you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I think this has been such a useful and insightful and indeed hopeful conversation, even in the face of the difficult circumstances that you are all working on so tirelessly. And on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for your efforts, your continued determination. And I'm just so grateful for your willingness to be with us and to share your thoughts and insights today. I will say that we'll now take about a 10-15 minute break. We'll resume at noon for a keynote address by renowned professor, author, and advocate Philippe Sands. And so again, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Take care. Mm-hmm.